Getting into chapter 10 now. The first section is called Solving Quadratic Equations by Completing the Square. So the square root property says that if I have x squared equal to r, where r would be some number, then x equals the square root of r, or negative square root of r, written more concisely as plus or minus the square root of r. So we get used to seeing that plus or minus sign there. Solve each using the square root property. So I'm going to get the n squared by itself. And then, since it's just n squared equals 36, I can square root. The square and the square root are inverses and they cancel. The square root of 36, if I'm writing it by hand, is plus or minus 6. In MyLabs, make sure you follow instructions for how they want you to answer it. If they say separate answers with a comma, then you're going to write it as two separate answers. So that one was nice because it came out as a whole number. Part B, when I move the 24, and then I square root, the square root of 24 is not a perfect square. Plus or minus sign just kind of automatically needs to go on there. And then 24 is 4 times 6. So I have plus or minus 2 square root of 6. Or if you put it as two separate answers, it would be 2 square root of 6 and negative 2 square root of 6. Letter C, before I square root, I want to get rid of that 7. I'm going to divide by 7. 112 divided by 7 is 16. Square root of each side. So we have 4 and negative 4, or plus or minus 4. Letter D, subtract the 16. This time I have z squared equals negative 20. Square root of negative 20, we still need the plus or minus sign. 20, it's negative, so I'm going to have negative 1, 4, and 5. What do I have? 2i square root of 5, or if you do two separate answers, it would be 2i square root of 5 and negative 2i square root of 5. So you just have to be real careful typing these into MyLabs to make sure that you get everything typed in like it's supposed to be. You don't want any little typos to be messing you up that much. Letter E, a little bit different this time because I have the x plus 3 in parentheses. This is a case where you actually don't want to FOIL. Because we have this equal signs equation, I can square root to cancel out the squared. So I just have x plus 3. And then the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. To get the x by itself, I'm going to subtract 3. So then negative 3 plus or minus 4. And then what we need to do is split this up into two separate problems. Negative 3 plus 4 and negative 3 minus 4. So my final answers are positive 1 and negative 7. Letter F, before I square root, I need to get the 12 to the other side. And then square root. So what do we have? Plus or minus? Negative 1, 4, and 3. Plus or minus 2i square root of 3. And then I'm going to add 2. This 2 is not like terms with the 2i root 3. So I have a equals 2 plus or minus 2i root 3. Or if you have to write it separately, it's going to be 2 plus 2i root 3 and 2 minus 2i root 3. So that was kind of an introduction introduction to what we need to talk about next, which is called completing the square. So completing the square, what it is, it's the process of creating a perfect square trinomial to be able to solve a problem using the square root property. And the steps for completing the square, the first step is to rewrite the problem in this form. I have noted that you will not have a coefficient in front of your x squared. If you do, you have to divide everything by that number. So you have your x squared and then your x term on one side of the equation, and you move the number by itself to the other side. The next step in the process of completing the square is to multiply b, that would be the number in front of the plane x, by a half, or divide by 2. It's the same process. Whatever that result is, square it, and then add that number to both sides of the equation. Then you will get a trinomial you can factor that can then be solved with the square root property. So let's do a couple of problems just by completing the square and then factoring. So on letter A, you notice we don't have an equation here. All we have is just an expression. So to complete the square with this expression, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the number that's in front of the n, the one that's not squared. So this is 10. And then divide it by 2, which equals 5. Take that number, square it, and that's 25. Add the 25 onto the problem, and then this is factorable. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to 25 and add to 10, which is 5 and 5. You're going to find it's always the same number twice. So it's n plus 5 times n plus 5. And then the reason this is called completing the square is because n plus 5 times n plus 5 can be written as n plus 5 squared. So if we repeat this process on letter B, we take the negative 16, divide it by 2, and get negative 8. Negative 8 squared is positive 64. So I'm going to add 64. Then I look for two numbers that multiply to 64 and add to negative 16, which is negative 8 and negative 8. Oh wait, I've seen those numbers before right there. It's always going to work out this way. On letter A, it was that 5. It was the answer to that second step before you squared it is what goes here. So the same is true on this one, x minus 8 squared. So on letter C, 6 divided by 2 is 3. So really, I could just go right to this point. The missing step I didn't write out would be to put that 9 in there. Negative 7 divided by 2. Uh-oh, we have a fraction. That's okay. We just have to work with the fraction. Negative 7 over 2 squared. That's 49 over 4. So we would be putting 49 over 4. But don't fret, because I know that this is just going to be minus 7 halves. It's going to be this over here. All right, before we go on to actual solving, we'll take a break in the videos.